Hi, if you've been checking out any of my videos, you'll find, or in the future, you will find, that they're basically going to be either guided meditations, discussion on what I call the Urban Monk Project, which is what I'm going to talk about today a little bit, or some kind of music, one of my music projects, or some combination thereof. So the urban monk topic will come up in a number of ways, and so I thought it might be worth spending just a little bit of time describing, explaining what that's all about. So in the most simple terms, the Urban Monk Project really basically describes my own path, my own seeking, my own evolution, understanding, my own waking up, and then that's basically translated into what I've discovered along the way that might be useful to others. So I'll try to outline it in a way that's straightforward and understandable and maybe useful to you. So I'm going to start with the premise that my observation, but the observation of many people, maybe all of us in a certain kind of way, that basically we're all born into the experience or a relationship with pure awareness. So as babies, we come into this world open, unafraid in the sense of having any kind of emotional or psychological fear. There might be some provisions to that, but fundamentally I think that's true. And we feel complete, and we're completely intimate with the sense of being. So we haven't yet developed a sense of self that's separate from the world. We're just responding to what's happening. We operate, as all beings do, on this instinctive, intuitive capacity for awareness and survival. So then somewhere along the line, the sense of separation comes in, which is fundamental to basically all of us, all human beings. And that's learned. So obviously, that's learned if we all come in this sort of more or less pure form. I wouldn't say blank slates, but pure form. We develop a sense of separation from the world and ultimately from ourselves through developing self-awareness. And that eventually is then perpetuated, exaggerated by influences like our family, culture eventually being the biggest one, which obviously also is how our family systems develop, organize themselves, find value. And this is obviously not a new observation. None of these are, really. I'm just outlining how I see it and how I got where I am and what it is I'm sharing in this process. So that felt sense of separation is essentially the root of most human suffering. Now, for everybody, there's going to be suffering that's unavoidable, there's going to be pain, there's going to be loss. But all of us know very well the ongoing sense of suffering caused by the sense of separation, which then expresses itself in basically two fundamental forms. A sense of lack, I'm not enough, which leads to both greed, but also a sense of trying to prove oneself or to be constantly trying to become something. So that's one of the fundamental expressions of a sense of separation. We feel separate, and because we feel separate, we start to suffer, and we try to alleviate that suffering by becoming what we are not. And that can take the form of accumulating things, but also accumulating experiences, accumulating relationships, accumulating status, money, all those kinds of things. So that's one of the forms that it takes. The other form that it takes is fear. The fear of death, the fear of danger, the fear of being excluded, the fear of being alone. So this sense of separation basically develops and then expresses itself in these two fundamental forms, and then there's myriad expressions, variations, nuances, combinations of those. So to alleviate that discomfort, to alleviate the suffering, which we're beings are programmed to do that. We're programmed to move away from that which is uncomfortable, threatens our survival, move towards what appears to be affirming, nurturing, safe. So we start to develop patterns of seeking for happiness, which are outside of us, because as we develop this sense of separation and come to believe it. So the limited mind really believes that it's separate because it can't imagine another way. That's why we can't use thought, sort of our typical way of the way that we eventually really perpetuate our separation by identifying with thought, perceptions, and feelings. We can't get to the happiness we're looking for from there. We develop patterns of seeking that are constructed out of that very sense of separation. So it's like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's a circular project. So we keep seeking. So we keep trying to get first on the kind of gross level. We try to accumulate things, and some of us continue on that path, convinced that that's going to end up with happiness. Doesn't mean that things don't bring some sense of happiness or that knowledge isn't useful. I'm not saying that, but the deep happiness that everybody is really looking for can't be achieved by those things alone. They could be part of an expression of it, they could be part of the path, and they usually are. And to some extent, the path, to the extent that there is one, will include seeing through the false promise of finding our happiness in these places. But it's circular using the mind. So the thing that's leading us to seeking is also the thing that prevents us from actually achieving in the end. And so we struggle. So functionally, this seeking and our response to suffering is expressed in either avoidance or clinging. But both of them represent a resistance to life as it is, which, as I said, turns out to be the very thing that we really are longing for. So what we're longing for is a sense of connection which we were born with, we were born into. It never leaves us. It takes lots of different shapes, and there is a way of being in the world in which that's realized. Maybe not 100%, but it can be realized and it can be developed. That ability to stay connected to it can be developed, so that we actually see it as our basic nature, our true nature. So all of us are seeking happiness, basically, in everything we do, which is super hard to see, obviously, and some of the ways that we express it, some of the ways that we seek it. Can often be easier to be suspect of other people. When you see some of their strategies for seeking happiness, it's clear from the outside. It's like, whoa, that's probably not going to end up well, and harder for us to see it for ourselves. But all of us, ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what we're looking for. Given the choice between happiness and not happiness, everybody will choose happiness, no matter what the alternative is. So that actually is what's motivating us. It's just that because we've developed a misunderstanding of what's actually happening and what our nature and our, you could say, circumstance, I guess, in the bigger picture, what that really is about, we end up seeking, it's like the old song, looking for love in all the wrong places. So, however, we can change that pattern, change those patterns. So relational life is realized both in seeking and interpreting. We both in seeking and interpreting how it is that we are in relationship to life. We need patterns. We need practices. That's actually how we start to understand the world. So, and you can see it with children, like they experiment with patterns. So their awareness leads them to see that the world, the form world, the world of phenomena, is operating on somewhat predictable patterns. So gravity, for example. So a child repeatedly pushes something off the end of the table to see if it happens every time. Does it actually drop to the floor every time? And we all do that. We all explore life and explore our understanding and our place in life through patterns. We use patterns. And we ourselves are, because we're not separate from life, we're an expression of it. We ourselves are the expression of patterns. So it's like fractals appearing in the world. And not only does the body express, not only is the body an expression of that, but our practices, the things we call practices, like in spiritual life, for example, meditation, you can see that as, in a certain kind of way, like a fractal pattern. There's really recognizable, predictable ways in which we come together to realize the truth of what's actually, who we actually are, and what's actually happening. So living well, finding some sense of happiness is really about finding a sense of well-being that's stable, consistent, and not subject to external changes. And we see this, it's pointed to in all of the wisdom traditions, and by accounts of others, and then if we start wandering down this path and really looking, we see that it actually can be verified by our own experience. We see that it's not only possible, but it's basically our birthright. So from the point of view of kind of direct teachings, direct path teachings, there is no path. And again, that information or that message is conveyed in all of the wisdom traditions in one way or another. The kingdom of God is within. There's nothing to be learned. What did Dogen say? From the beginning, nothing is hidden. But because we develop this sense of separation, and we come to believe it, and we form patterns that perpetuate that belief, that we use as proof of that belief, we do need to do something to break the patterns. So it's one thing to say that by nature, I'm an awake Buddha, but it needs to be realized, and what happens is our patterns obscure our ability to stay connected. Our delusional patterns are also an expression of that awakeness, but that's not very comforting from the point of view of our patterned way, our habitual way of identifying with experience, identifying with thought, identifying with emotions, identifying with sensations, absent a connection to an open sense of awareness that holds all of that. So it feels fractured, it feels separate. We feel like we're not intimate with what's happening, and we're constantly in the business of pushing away or trying to pull towards. So it's about breaking those patterns, and to break those patterns, we essentially need to embrace patterns. So we also need to we can use them in a different way. So we develop patterns that keep us separate, and those patterns need to be abandoned, and in order to abandon those patterns, we basically have to adopt other patterns, other ways of being that will support us, so we get to the point, so that we actually can come to a point where we can see what's true for us. It's not really such a mystery. We can identify them. We can't, the Urban Monk Project is not about identifying like a very specific recipe. It's more about just pointing to the reality that this is what human beings are up to, and there are identifiable patterns, identifiable practices, habits that we can identify ones that are not likely to help you realize your true nature, and we can point to others that are really likely to do so. And one way or the other, all human beings end up taking up patterns. We live in a phenomenal world that's operating with patterns. There's day and night, and there's resting, and there's sleeping, and there are seasons, and our bodies are vibrating in rhythms. Everything is operating in this kind of patterned way. So we need to be able to align ourselves with patterns that actually will ultimately end up freeing us from the tyranny of patterns in a certain kind of way. So they free us from the tyranny of thinking we are one thing or another thing. And that we actually are able to abide in the infinite possibility and the eternal time, rather than abiding continually in the limited mind that's subject to temporality, the limited body that's subject to time and space. So in order to free ourselves from the limitation of those patterns, those perceived patterns, and to see that we are actually part of life that is not, we're part of the being, the lifing that's happening on the planet, that's not subject to those things, that's not changing, that's eternal, that's infinite, is not limited. And the way that we see that is through the patterns of limitation. So we need to take up practices in ways that will help us see what our true nature is. That's basically what the Urban Monk Project is about.